and remediation. So we're going to have quite a layout here. So we'll be starting with no stranger to the stage, Mr. Nick Albergo, GHD, Senior Advisor, I think is the title these days, maybe, something like that.
So many people listening.
And Nick will be, I was interested because he starts off his title, what was it? I think he said, the world turned upside down. So I think we're talking about tariffs maybe, but you never know with Nick. So with no further ado, sir.
Good afternoon. They always put me right after lunch. Makes sense, right? So while people are still coming in the room, anybody familiar with the torpedo bats? Heard the story about? They're very cool, right? But as an engineer, I can tell you they're not causing additional home runs. So what happened was the Yankees wound up setting a new Major League Baseball record of 15 home runs in 3 games. And they're using these new so-called torpedo bats. But essentially what they've done is they've moved the mass of the bat more towards the handle instead of being on the tip. And what that basically does is lower the moment of inertia, for those of you that are engineers. And so the bat's going to feel lighter in your hands, okay? And if it feels lighter, the idea is that you'll swing faster. So if that was the only story, then maybe you could see where you'd have more home runs. But when you do that, it also, bringing it down, also lowers and lessens the inertia in the bat-ball collision, which would do the opposite. So it's not causing more home runs. If anything, I think what it's doing is with more mass towards the handle, I think these guys are going to be able to stay in the box longer and actually foul off a few more balls because they've got more mass near their hands. But that's it. So the whole philosophy out there that these guys are hitting more home runs because of it, no, they're not. Engineering-wise, it doesn't work that way. That's it. That's all I got today.
Great. That was perfect. I'm a travel ball dad, so that was super interesting.
Oh, yeah, the BB core. Yeah, oh, yeah, youth bats are a big deal. Yeah, I'd love to get on that stuff. So anyhow, I'm going to bounce around in my presentation since about 21 or 22 of my 28 slides have already been covered. So you could imagine if I was a young guy and this was my first presentation, I'd probably be freaking out about right now, figuring out what I'm going to say. But I'm an old guy and I really don't give a shit. So I'll be just fine up here. So I'm proposing as a start a new element for PFAS in the periodic table. And we're just going to call it the element of confusion. Because I think first and foremost, unless we come up with a standardized definition for PFAS, we're going to have all sorts of issues trying to talk about assessment and remediation and health risks and all that stuff. So I think first and foremost, we're going to have to do something about that. Where's the thing that changes the stuff? Okay, and I just hit the button. Cool. We can do that. So you're all familiar with Lee Zeldin, and as all good politicians do, he covered all the bases. He said at his confirmation hearing that PFAS enforcement was going to be his top priority, but then he also says he wants to balance environmental and economic concerns, and he also says he acknowledges industry concerns about the regulations, how it might impact business. So if you take those 3 statements, he's pretty much got everybody covered, which is a good start for a politician. Now, Taryn's already gone over this roadmap stuff. I won't bore you or bother you doing it again. I just want to mention, though, that I hate to see some of the more future forward-looking plans stalled out. And those included this idea that we were going to try to get upstream of the problem and basically prevent PFAS from entering the environment to begin with. And then probably more importantly, as I just mentioned, one of the other things we were going to work on was trying to ensure a science-based decision-making process It's something we're in desperate need of when we're talking about PFAS. And unfortunately, this part of the roadmap is likely stalled as well. So that's not great news. You're probably familiar with the Trump administration's use of the Midnight Rules Relief Act. If you just look at the bottom of my slide there, I think that's probably the most important. And that is, I think ultimately we're going to see some delay and some reduced scope and even some rollback in enforcement and in regulations. I think that that's just the way things are going to go over the next few years. You also saw this already. I think what's instructive here is that if we've got 13% of our public water systems exceeding PFOS and 11% exceeding PFOA, then the question becomes, who's going to pay? Where's the money going to come from to fund bringing all of our water plants into compliance by 2029? I mean, you can pass all the regulation you want. I don't know where the money's going to come from for this kind of initiative to treat and this is just drinking water I'm talking about. So I think that that's the big question. And considering how much of our system already has contaminants above the standards, that's going to be a big issue. All right, so you all also heard about these court cases, and again, not going to, retrace ground you've already heard about this morning. But I think some of the arguments that they've laid out that I mentioned here are important because those aren't going away. So the idea that the Safe Drinking Water Act doesn't permit regulation of mixtures is going to be a detail that EPA is going to have to somehow confront, because the way they came up with their standards is they absolutely did that. In addition to that, they took certain liberties with this idea of demonstrating a substantial likelihood of adverse human effect. Basically, what they said wasn't substantial. They used a possibility in their interpretation. And I think, much like the ASTM standard, there's a big difference between what's possible and what's likely. And so I think they're going to have difficulty there. And then finally, the biggest one of all that keeps coming up is there was no cost-benefit analysis done. And that is something that they are required to do, and they didn't do it. So one way or another, they're going to have to overcome these arguments, these legal arguments, and I think it's going to be a high bar for them to actually overcome these issues. And they're going to keep showing up. You also heard about CERCLA already, and I just again would point to the bottom of my slide, mention you that even if the regulation's halted, the liability isn't. And that's going to wind up being a bit of a problem, I think, with some of the actions that you're going to see out in the marketplace. Now, EPA put out a memo back in, April 19th of 2024 that already said they have no intentions of chasing after community water systems and POTWs and MS4s and airports and farms where there's biosolids. They've already said they're not going to use CERCLA to beat them over the head and try to chase these things. So a lot of the most obvious folks are going to be okay no matter what winds up happening. But you could still get third-party liability issues and some other claims. And so, one way or another, I think the liability piece of CERCLA is probably going to rear its head from time to time. Again, litigation associated, you heard about it this morning with CERCLA. Same kind of legal arguments. One is the misinterpretation of what's substantial damage or danger. There's notice issues. Cost, again, issues where they failed to consider cost. This idea of imposing retroactive liability on passive receivers is extremely unpopular and will likely have to be addressed. And then, of course, there's no Chevron deference left anymore. And so all of this effort that EPA put into interpreting their understanding of the regulations, and that used to carry sway in courts, isn't the case anymore. And so other people and hacks like myself will be able to get up and pontificate on a different approach depending on who's paying our bill, and argue that. And let's face it, you know, when you look at the talent that's in the private sector versus what little talent's left at EPA, they're going to have a tough time. You know, it's going to be like the New York Yankees going against my kid's baseball team, right? You heard about the TSCA stuff. Again, I'm just running through these slides because everything's been talked about already. I just want to mention that with regards to that, one of the things TSCA did do is come up with this completely unwieldy definition of PFAS. So they went crazy, right? And so they're looking at chemical moieties, which is, you know, a segment of the molecule. They're looking at saturated carbons, which talks about atomic bonding. They're looking at R groups, which brings in the whole polarity, acidity, basicity, reactivity. And they're bringing all these things into ways to define PFAS, which, quite frankly, for the folks in industry, they're going to have no clue what any of that means. And one of the other things that wasn't mentioned this morning, but is kind of important, is that in their efforts to classify PFAS compounds as chemicals of special concern, it eliminated the de minimis exemption that used to exist within TRI reporting. And so it used to be the small ingredients, the things that didn't carry a lot of actual ratio in whatever the product was, could be just listed as de minimis and you didn't have to report it. That's not the case anymore. And as a result, these small amounts of PFAS are going to have to be reported. But as it turns out right now, if you look at the SDS sheets and stuff, they're not even on there. So there's going to have to be a whole new effort to try to address and circle back to that stuff in TSCA. We heard about RCRA. See, I'm going to give everybody a lot more time. We heard about landfills. Heard about biosolids. We did that. We did that. One thing to say about product packaging and chemicals is what I have at the bottom here. There's not going to be any funding for enforcement, so it's fine that they went through this effort to, you know, rule make and try to prevent inactive PFAS from re-entering commerce, and they came up with all these different types of PFAS that have been made, and, you know, supposedly they're not going to make their way back in. But, you know, the fox is watching the hen house. So you can expect this stuff's going to wind up finding its way back in if there's no enforcement element at all. The AFFF thing, again, I'll just mention, it's been talked about already. But a couple of things, you know, to think about. One is, I don't know what we plan on doing with the stockpiles of this stuff. I'm pretty close to the fire departments, at least in the Tampa Bay area, and I also work for one of the big fire manufacturing, equipment manufacturing people, and they're not hearing really good things about the replacement. Apparently it doesn't blanket nearly as well, and it dissipates quicker, and so there's some issues out there about whether or not it's as effective. And what is a bit of a freak out is that the FAA is not willing to indemnify the use of the new stuff. And so the fire departments are put in a really weird position. And then, of course, the other thing is, while we're talking about all this parts per trillion stuff, you know, there's guidance out there that says for the AFFF tanks and so forth, you single rinse them and then you can send everything to a landfill. Well, that makes no sense at all. There's no way that stuff is clean after a single rinse. So it just seems like we're all over the place in terms of what's happening out there. And because of that, maybe it's not a horrible thing that we take a pause on all this, you know. It's a weird way we're doing it, I'll give you that, but it might not be such a bad thing that we take a bit of a pause. I guess what you guys are going to talk about phase ones and stuff, so you know, it's not a big deal for phase ones. For the most part, having PFAS is not going to be a wreck. We think about BAPs. We got BAPs everywhere, and we don't make that a wreck either. If you don't have a facility and you don't have a circular release, then it's not going to be a wreck. And as far as legally applied biosolids as an example, as long as they were legally applied and you don't have evidence of something else, it's not going to be a wreck, at least in Florida. Because why? Because there's no disposal by definition. So I don't really see much happening there. Jorge did the state stuff, so I'll go push beyond that. It was a really good presentation until you guys all did it already. The green one down there, that's got something in it. One of the things to keep in mind is, especially when we talk about destruction and incineration, which, by the way, I'm a big fan of. I think ultimately we're going to have to do some sort of destruction. But just recognize we're not really sure exactly what we're going to wind up with if we get incomplete destruction, which is highly likely. And we might wind up with stuff that's worse than what we started with. And here again, the science hasn't caught up. So that gets us to strategies. You've already been hearing about some of the different strategies out there, and I've just listed some of the ones that are pretty common in the marketplace, at least for drinking water. Because let's face it, I think ultimately, with the money being the way it is, we're probably going to have to focus our financial resources on the front end. Either the source water before it hits the water treatment plant or right after it hits the water treatment plant. I'm not convinced personally that we're ever going to get to cleaning up soil and groundwater to any significant degree, at least in Florida. I don't know where the money's going to come from. And we're getting really good at mathematically making things go away anyhow. So, at the end of the day, like I said earlier, Chris Teef put it best. You're all going to die, but it ain't going to be from PFAS, right? No one's eaten 5 grams a day for 70 years, and the way you all drink and smoke and everything else in your lives, it ain't going to matter anyhow. Bunch of you are fat, all sorts of issues you got. It ain't PFAS. But PFAS is sexy, let's face it, right? So there's a lot of cool stuff to talk about in PFAS. But ultimately, I think the strategy is going to have to be one that includes both removal and destruction. One without the other is not going to make a lot of sense. But when you remove PFAS, it's got to go somewhere. That's where the destruction is going to come in. So I'm a big fan for concentrating the waste stream first. I don't care how you do it, but we got to concentrate it somehow. And then we can look at destruction, because scaling up destruction is cost prohibitive, at least at these grand scales that we're looking at. But as you know, they all got positives and negatives. We've got to deal with other kinds of organic carbons that compete. There's just stuff that's in the water that makes things less efficient. And anything we can do to remove us from having to treat it just to dump it again is probably ultimately the way things are going to have to go. There's been some, I don't know, did somebody talk about bio already? I don't remember. Bioremediation with PFAS is going to be really tricky. I guess it's possible. I know that there's some research out there on it, but it's not very efficient in any kind of reasonable time frame, so I'm not sure where that's going to go. So bottom line is, we got no one size fits all. We're going to have to pay attention to the water chemistry to make good decisions. And as I mentioned, the minerals play hell with RO, and the TOC plays hell with adsorption. So, if you're not paying attention, It looks good until you put the pilot system in. Then you start to lose momentum, and if you lose it at the pilot system, you're going to have a heck of a time trying to scale it up. And that's basically what I'm getting at here. She's got a test tube that she's now got PFAS-free water. It only cost us $500 to get 40 mils. That's going to be a problem. And I think that that's probably the huge challenge we've got as we move forward. But before we talk any more about that, I think the place to start, as I mentioned, is going to be about a definition. So I gave you one example of a definition with the toxic inventory that was way, way, way too complicated. Here's a couple of examples of much easier definitions. And if you notice, that, all I'm saying here is that here's two states. One state says they want you to contain at least 2 fully fluorinated carbon atoms. And here's another state that says at least 1 is good enough. And the problem with that is there's a big difference between 1 and 2. We got any of our lab? Is Nick out there? Lab guys out there? Where the hell did they go? Oh, they're over there in the conference room, I guess. Oh. Anyhow, for the chemists that might be out there, there's a big difference between 1 and 2. And so there's a lot of drawbacks. One is the ambiguity in chemical identification. So it could include substances that don't exhibit the typical properties and high persistence of PFAS, especially if you're just talking about 1 fully fluorinated atom. It's going to lead to inconsistencies in studies and reports. You're not going to be able to compare apples to apples with the scientific research that's going on, and it's going to, as a result, hamper any kind of development of coherent mitigation strategies because you're not going to know what kind of PFAS they were dealing with. As a result of that, it's going to confuse compliance as well, and that's where we start to come into play. And if it confuses compliance, then it's also going to result in inefficient monitoring and remediation. It's going to increase both the regulatory as well as the remediation costs. It's probably going to impact innovation because the people that are doing the innovating need to know what it is they're innovating on, and it makes a big difference what that definition is. So at the very least, while we're in this state of confusion that I'm talking about, it'd be really good if we could, as a group, come up with one definition that applied to everything, that we could all live with, and that would bring our science in line, our research in line, our technologies, our regulatory compliance. Everything would start to become a lot more clear if we could do that. I don't know if we'll be able to or not. So I got the Albergo-like post. Figured I'd finish up with, what do I like? Well, as I already told you, I like stuff that's combined. I think that ultimately we're going to have to look at that. Now, somebody already talked about foam fracking today. I like that. I like to add that, if we stick that along with electrochemical oxidation, to me, that's a beautiful thing because we know electrochemical oxidation on its own is too expensive to scale up. But if we use the foam fracking to reduce, and I'm talking about significantly reducing the volume, then something like electrochemical oxidation can make sense. We ultimately break the carbon-fluorine bond, and as a result, we don't need any more treatment. There's this stuff called Aqua PRS out there. It's an adsorbent system. It uses a suspended, very fine material compared to a GAC or a resin, and that's followed by separation, but is a lot more efficient than the ion exchange and some of the GACs that are out in the marketplace. And then you've also heard about the nanobubble oxidation. I don't know, do we have somebody talking about nanobubbles? Anybody know? That's some really cool stuff that's coming out. It uses trillions of ozone-infused nanobubbles in a liquid stream. And then they use UV light to weaken the carbon-fluorine bond. but it doesn't weaken the ozone because it's protected by the nanobubble. And then what happens is there's hydroxyl radicals that are generated by the ozone nanobubbles, and they can finish the job and weaken the carbon-fluorine bond. They're getting 99.99% effective treatment as a result, which is pretty cool stuff. So, you know what? Maybe it's not such a bad approach that we take a pause on all this stuff and we allow the confusion to kind of make its way through, you know, a series of steps so that we can keep our eye on the big picture. And as a result, we don't have any knee-jerk reactions that cost this country a fortune and make us all look like fools when we only get half the job of treatment done after we committed to a more sufficient job than that. As I mentioned, I think ultimately we're going to have to treat at the source. We'll risk away the rest. And in the interim, we'll allow science to catch up. Thank you very much. Right on schedule, too. Look at that, like it's my first time.
I do want to hold questions till the end, if you wouldn't mind, and we want to make sure everybody gets their time in up here to speak. So next up, we have a dynamic duo tag team with Miss Olivia Kane from Geosyntec, project engineer with them, and then Travis Moore-Hearn, sheriff